Good day, ladies and gentlemen. It was the end of the 1990s. Metal Gear Solid had taken the world by storm. Rainbow Six One had taken the PC world by storm and was testing many the mettle of the first-person shooter gamer. And the N64 wanted to put its own piece of 1913 rail on the tactical M4. And so, it came out with Winback, Covert Operations. This would be the very first tactical game that I would ever play. Now, I did not acquire this game until the year 2000, and I have to say that it impressed me a great deal. So with that, let's fire up the old RetroArch and take a look at it.
Operation Winback was developed by Omega Force and published by Koei on September 23rd, 1999. It was directed by Tomori Miyazaki, and today we are looking at the N64 version, and this version is being emulated using RetroArch, and the core being used is the Mupen 64 core. The parallel N64 core does work, but there are a few graphical glitches, and I recommend the Mupen 64 version due to its more accurate emulation. The controller being used is the Logitech F310, and it works quite well when emulating the N64 controller. Winback, Covert Operations is a tactical third-person shooter and is one that has aged very, very well. The controls are quite excellent, and unlike with other third-person shooters from this era, it does not feel clunky in the slightest. And that is a very good thing, because this game is
about a 10 on the Mohs scale of hardness.
You need the controls to be quick and responsive, because if they weren't, you would die even faster than you normally would. This is a classic-style third-person shooter. The camera is behind the back, and like in many third-person shooters of this era, you can lock onto the enemy. But unlike in third-person shooters of this era, you can use laser sight aiming. That's right, Resident Evil 4 didn't invent everything! Laser sight aiming in this game works just like it does in RE4, and even with the rather sensitive N64 analog stick, you can pull off headshots quite easily. And since this is one of those games that was really ahead of its time, it actually matters where you hit the enemy. It takes numerous shots to the body to take down an enemy, but it takes only one shot to the head to down a standard foot soldier. Since this is a tactical third-person shooter, you cannot just run and gun. Instead, you have to use cover and concealment, and this game was designed so that there would be a difference between the two. The camera is well programmed, and it's easy to see around corners, and it never just up and decides to point at a bloody wall. Overall, the controls and camera and cover mechanics hold up amazingly well, and are still in many respects top tier even today. Graphically, the game has aged a great deal, but it still looks halfway decent, and for the time it was quite impressive. While the graphics might be low poly, the levels have been designed excellently and are large and sprawling. The gameplay is not just a constant shootout. There are key hunts, minor puzzles, and traps that must be disarmed. The overall shooting gameplay never really gets old, as each shootout is an edge-of-one-seat affair. You have a big health bar, but the way that damage is calculated is a bit different. Remember, tactical third-person shooter. You can take hits in non-vital areas and only a little bit of health will be lost. Take it in a vital area and a bunch of health will be lost. CQB is another aspect that can get you killed fast. If an enemy slits your throat, you die in one hit. If an enemy bashes you over the head with a rifle butt, you die in one bloody hit. So you really have to be on your toes and make damn sure that the enemy does not close with you. It's not 100% realistic, but it is more realistic than the average third-person shooter, and makes for a very difficult but satisfying gaming experience.
At least in 2018. Back in the year 2000, I never finished it. Sure, the game gives you plenty of health packs, but I usually died before I could ever get to them, and eventually I got so frustrated I just said forget it, and went back to Turok 2.
The game uses a checkpoint system, and the checkpoints are very few and far between, and you can literally die in an instant. This is one of those games where you can lose it, meaning you can be doing really good, killing everything in sight and not taking a single hit, only for you to turn a corner and completely be eviscerated in the time it takes you to shout the word "God damn it!" So that being said, save states are your friend. Save early and save often, otherwise you will want to chuck the N64 controller out the goddamn window.
Oh, and did I mention that the game is timed?
And depending on your time, you can either get the good or bad ending. In 2018, it's not that big of a deal since you can just use save states, and I was easily able to get the good ending. In the game, you only get access to a very few weapons. With limited weapon choice, you have a few good weapons, and they will generally be weapons that you actually use. You start the game with 3 weapons and can acquire 2 later on. Your primary weapon is the holy icon of JMB. The sacred icon does great damage, and it can be used to pull off numerous headshots, and the pistol itself is imbued by the very spirit of John Moses Browning, as it features infinite ammo. This pistol will be used all throughout the game, and will allow you to conserve ammo in your other weapons. Lastly, the 3D model still looks great, even to this day. Next, you have the Heckler & Koch MP5. This is a weapon that is quite useful for taking on numerous enemies. While the sacred icon of JMB is powerful, these 7-round mags can be rather limiting. The MP5, while somewhat weak, does allow you to put paid to numerous enemies at any one time. And as befitting an SMG, it actually has longer range than the sacred icon. You start the game carrying only a few mags, but as you play the game, you can find mag pouches lying around, and thus by the end of the game, you can carry a considerable number of spares. Reloading in this game can be done at any time. You don't have to run a mag dry to pop in a new one. Now, this is actually pretty good. Sometimes you need more than, say, 15 shots. However, the game doesn't know how loaded a magazine actually is, meaning that you can accidentally hit the reload button and drop a fully loaded magazine. I actually ended up doing this when I transitioned from the N64 version of this game to the PS2 version of this game. The reload button was actually in a different place, and I kept thinking I was tapping the cover button. And I actually ran through every single one of my bloody magazines. So keep that in mind when playing either this or the PS2 version of this game. You then got the Spaz 12 Shotty that actually has the stock extended. But alas, it's only set to pump action mode. It is an excellent weapon when dealing with close quarters enemies. Reloading for the Shotty is thankfully brisk. You just load up 1 or 2 shells, and then the rest are magically teleported in by John Moses Browning. Like with the MP5, you start off carrying only a few shells, but as you up your inventory space, you can eventually carry a great many of them. These 3 weapons are well chosen as they allow you to vary up your tactics depending on the situation. One of the big issues with third-person shooters in the modern era is the fact that enemies can be all handled with the weakest weapon in the game, thus making all other weapons superfluous. Big case in point is the Dead Space trilogy. In all 3 games, all you ever need is the plasma cutter. If you have steady aim and a quick trigger finger, all the other weapons are so much trash. And really, in Dead Space, you are never in that much danger anyway, so long as you keep upgrading the plasma cutter. This makes for rather stale combat that is only saved by great atmosphere. Winback strives to be better than the game released in 2008. These 3 weapons complement each other. The Icon of Browning is only good against small numbers of enemies and has limited range. The MP5 is weak, but it has longer range and can deal with numerous enemies quickly on 1 magazine. The shotgun is devastating at close range and can put down enemies in a single body shot. Throughout the game, you will find yourself at 1 hit point. When that low, you need 1-hit kills so that an enemy does not get a shot off and chip away that 1 last hit point. Each weapon has its place in your arsenal, and you will actually use all 3 all throughout the game. thus giving Winback Covert Operations some really varied combat that requires you to use strategy to prevail. You can pick up a silent 380 pistol that can be used if you want to go for a stealthier run, but both in 2000 and now, I like to go loud and proud. And speaking of loud and proud, you get a rocket lawn chair, and it has its uses against bosses and entrenched positions. You also get a little roll move, and like with the other elements of this game, you really need to learn when to deploy it, as it can save your ass in many places throughout the game. You can go into a menu where you can check out your various weapons and select between them. And trust me, sometimes you're going to want to do this, as you will need that much more time to react to your enemy's changing tactics. Then you have a map, and lastly you have your team roster. When you start the game, you will see MIA by all of them, but as you play throughout the game, KIA becomes an all too common occurrence. The bosses of the game are colorful and memorable as befitting an Eastern game. Some are kind of mundane, others are, well, here is Sergeant Thunder. He attacks you with a Flammenwerfer, and you have to dodge his flame streams while dealing with his goons as well. Save states are your friend. The game has a great difficulty curve, and there is no massive difficulty spike. This is a game that does pacing quite well, and the game gets better and better as it goes along. Sound for the game is quite good. As this is an N64 game, there is no voice acting in the cutscenes. But there is voice acting for the various enemies, and it's done well enough and does not sound too compressed. The weapons sound quite good, and I get a bit nostalgic when I hear that shotgun go off. Pure bliss. Music for the game is also excellently done, although it is not something that I listen to on a routine basis like with the Doom soundtrack. The general track that plays is good and does not get annoying, and allows the player to concentrate on not dying. When you lose enough health, the track speeds up and gets more complex, thus spurring the player on to do better.
Now, let's take a deep dive into the story.
As befitting a Japanese game, the story is done in the same style as many Eastern animation productions. It is ostensibly a thriller plot, but done with an Eastern interpretation, similar in mindset to the Metal Gear franchise. Like with any pre-9/11 thriller, you have some rather, shall we say, diverse terrorists breaking into a secret science facility and taking it over. The cutscene is well animated and well paced as well, and gets the point across without any dialogue whatsoever. It uses visuals to tell the story, and it uses them well. In the end, the terrorists use the ion cannon from Command & Conquer to blow something up off screen.
Billy D ain't gonna like that.
After our villains are set up, we are then introduced to our heroes, and oh, by the great space dragon, they didn't. They couldn't! Surely they could have called an English speaker before choosing this name! We have the Scat Team. Spec Force just wasn't good enough for you, was it? You had to try and outdo the STARS team from Resident Evil, huh? Well, SCAT is an acronym for Special Covert Action Team, which doesn't sound that bad, and I bet that the devs came up with that first and just didn't realize how bad the acronym was going to be. The introduction scene for the Special Covert Action Team is something straight out of Predator, and I mean it's almost line for line and point for point. The biggest departure from Predator is the fact that the devs couldn't afford Arnie and instead had Jean-Claude Van Damme be the main player character. And the name is quite close to Jean-Claude Van Damme, although it's actually far funnier, as your player character is named Jean-Luc Cougar.
Originally, it was meant to be Jean-Paul Milf.
The Special Covert Action Team is introduced well, and you get a good feel for all the characters in just a few short moments. Lieutenant Dan gives you the various objectives that hilariously get jettisoned shortly after he gives them when the helo chopper gets hit. He says, just make it up as you go along. The basic objective is, of course, to win back the secret science facility and take back control of the ion cannon and thus make Billy D. Williams very happy. Before the chopper can be destroyed, the special covert action team paradrops and thus Jean-Luc Cougar gets stuck in. You fight the foes that must be fit and then rendezvous with one of your teammates. Store brand Carl Weathers is, of course, the first of your team to shuffle off the mortal coil. But at least he was sniped by one of the anime villains. A short time later, you face your first boss, a hot chick apparently named Leela? Well, anyway, she is most attractive and is armed with an M60. Now, I don't really want to fight her and would rather just take her to the movies. But alas, she is just one crazy-ass bitch! And she must be terminated. The boss fight is quite fun and quite difficult. But that's nothing a bunch of quick saves can't fix. With Leela dead, Jean-Luc then decides to try and complete one of the objectives, which was securing an express elevator. Some goons show up and Jake the Snake tells you to get a move on, and he gets to killing. As you fight throughout the game, it is hinted that there is a piece of scat amongst the scats. The team itself does not take lightly to this, but they have no choice but to complete the mission. The writing for the game is actually quite good, and is very much like a late 80s anime. It is simultaneously serious and hilarious, and gives the game a great human quality to it. The game knows what it is, but does not either go too goofy or too serious.
One thing that really surprised me was the fact that most of your team dies through the course of the game.
And it doesn't do it in an overly dramatic way. The enemy actually kills members of your team, thus showing that they are a threat, but your team also gives as good as they get, thus showing that they are not pushovers. Eventually, we get introduced to the leader of the terrorists, Anime Hair, aka Cecil.
But of course, he's only one half as devious as his brother Bob.
As befitting a generic anime villain, he ends up betraying the other terrorists at the end of the game so that he can hold the US for ransom. And how much ransom money does old Cecil want? Well, he wants a rather paltry sum of $100 million. In all reality, this kind of plot never made all that much sense. Even if they got the money, the odds of them being able to actually spend it on anything are very low, and they have to know that. And there's a lot easier ways to extort $100 million than stealing a weapon of mass destruction. But hey, if they just, committed securities fraud, this wouldn't be a very exciting game, now would it?
At the climax of the game, we of course have a twist.
The traitor amongst the scats was Lieutenant Dan! Angered that his half of the Bubba Gump Strip Company was down in terms of money, he got into terrorism so that he could get revenge on Forrest Gump! Okay, maybe he didn't do that, but what we have here is a typical anime revenge plot. Dan and Mr. Cougar do battle, and by the great Talos is this a tough fight. If I had to play this legitimately, I would have surrounded my N64 in Tannerite and blown it up! Thankfully, with save states, it's still tough, but doable. My N64 will live for another day. With Lieutenant Dan simply wounded, he tells you that he was secretly loyal to Ostrotska, hence why he turned against everyone. But he does say that the guild has made his life a living hell, so I guess that makes it better.
It's a common anime trope, but in all reality, this would not happen. There is absolutely no way that Lieutenant Dan could even come close to the clearance necessary to be in charge of a high-level Spec Ops team. When you want to be a top-tier commander, you get your past investigated quite a bit. And with all the baggage that Lieutenant Dan has, well, I don't think he would even have the clearance to clean the toilets on a high-level military base.
With Lieutenant Dan dead, Cecil, the most diabolical of all terrorists, engaged you in mortal combat. This is the final boss fight of the game, and by the great Ysmir, is it even tougher than the previous one. And if you die, you go back.
If you die, you go back to Lieutenant Dan's boss fight. That's right, you have to survive both bloody boss fights.
If I hadn't used save states, that N64 would have been blown up with tannerite and the ashes turned into a Sega Saturn. Cecil is tough because in addition to shooting you, he also tosses grenades at you that do considerable splash damage. After you shove a shotty up Cecil's ass, the game comes to a close, and you and the last surviving member of your team, a Jill Valentine-esque hot chick, reunite, and in the good ending, you both decide to blow up the ion cannon because it's too much power in the hands of one government. The end.
Wait, what?
This is one of those idiotic media things where some new weapon system is the worst thing ever, and the evil US cannot have it. What's to stop them from building it again? Oops. But whatever. Operation Winback is without a doubt a masterpiece and is a complete game. It has great writing, great gameplay, great pacing, great music, and an excellent ending. Like with many of the Resident Evils, you unlock certain things when you complete the game, such as infinite ammo and things of that nature. If you hate the N64 graphics, worry not. There is a complete remake on the PS2 that is the same game, just with better graphics and, unfortunately, voice acting. I feel the voice acting for this version makes the game a little less cheesy. Just compare these two scenes.
Damn it, a laser! One slip and I'll be fried.
Yeah, the PS2 version might be a little more serious, but I like the Crispy Critter line, goddammit! Winback Covert Operations would receive a sequel in 2004 called Winback 2 Project Poseidon, and it looks pretty damn good, and eventually I will get around to reviewing it.
Winback Covert Operations is yet another masterpiece on the N64. Oh sure, the PS1 might have beat the N64 in sales, but it did not beat the N64 in game quality. And I, of course, cannot recommend it enough. And so, I am Generallotz, and I'm going to wish you good, Winback 2, and Turok 2, whatever makes you happy.
If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing, and if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon so that I can continue bringing you this awesome content.